There we go. Okay. So we're going to extend the economic analysis, the stuff that we've been doing so far, trying to understand this like consumer behavior in a market context. So using our tools like methodological individualism, the idea of rational actors, economizing behavior, and understanding the incentives and how incentives shape people's actions. We're going to take this from a market setting and apply it to non-market settings. So when people are trying to deal with themselves and they're trying to organize society, when they're trying to talk to one another and solve disputes between one another. Now, there's a lot of beliefs out there that might seem like odd superstitions, that there's no reason we think that they should exist, or we think they should make societies worse off. But in fact, they're actually these rational responses to problems that are faced by society. And they're really clever ways to come up with some sort of solution so they can live decent lives without a lot of conflict. Remember, economics requires the assumption of rationality. This is kind of what we're building our analysis upon. So it's important that we actually, provide some evidence that people actually act rationally. So this is going to be an exercise. This and the next class or so is we're going to be breaking down these practices that we think of as weird and using the tools of economics to understand them. So what does rationality mean in everyday life? Typically, we think of like the gang from It's Always Sunny in the one episode where they just chant, reason will prevail. You think of using like no emotion, only weighing facts. Think of people as like automatons, that they're not actually living like human beings. But when we talk about rationality in economic analysis, what we mean is that people act within their own self-interest. They do what they think is best for them. So if someone's offered two bundles of goods, say a 6-pack of beer and a 12-pack of the same exact beer, they're going to choose the 12-pack. They'll choose more of the good than less of the same good. So people try to meet their needs as best as possible, considering both the cost of the action and the benefit of the action. That people try to act or try to do what's best for themselves, best for their family. Remember, because we're not saying with rationality that people don't have any sort of altruism. They do have altruism. Often we consider doing good for other people good for us as well. So rationality doesn't preclude that, it actually includes that. And like I said, rationality is necessary for economic analysis. We can't predict people's actions if we think that they're just completely random. People need to be able to respond to incentives, and we should be able to predict how they respond to incentives. So there's the idea of nudge theory. Cass Sunstein and a few other people talk about how people, they believe, are irrational. So we need to redesign the way we do things in order to nudge them to make the proper decision. For instance, people tend to not save enough for retirement. So one thing is, instead of having employers allow employees to opt into a 401k, Sunstein says force them to go into the 401k and allow them to opt out. In both cases, only 30% of people choose to make a different decision. So if you force people to opt in, only 30% are going to save for retirement. But if you force everyone to save for retirement, only 30% are going to opt out. So by changing the way, like the automatic, whether you save for retirement or not, you can change how many people save for retirement. Another idea is grocery stores. Grocery stores, they put a lot of thought and money into how they design it to maximize the amount of time the consumers spend in there. And they spread out all the staples, like you'll have dairy in one corner, vegetables in another, meat somewhere else. So you have to zigzag through the entire store, so you spend more time shopping there. And they place things like high impulse purchases like candy right by the checkout, where there's like a high impulse area. Sunstein again suggests, Americans are too fat, so we need to give them fruit and vegetables or make those, a more prominent part of people's diets. So we should place them in front of the checkout instead of candy. He says this because people are irrational, but actually, in order for nudge theory to work, people need to be rational. You need to understand how they're going to respond to these incentives, and they need to respond consistently. Or if you lower the cost of something, you place the healthy food right in front of them, they'll be more likely to consume it. Now, one of the arguments against rationality is some of the weird things people do. There's a lot of odd practices all across the world, not just in the past. The ones we're going to talk about today are mostly done in the past, but things that are being done today seem fairly weird. So we're going to start with witch doctors. So the Soviet Union collapsed late 1980s, early 1990s, and we saw the reemergence of market economies in the Eastern Europe that used to be behind the Iron Curtain. One of my professors in grad school, Pete Leeson, along with a bunch of other PhD candidates, went over to Eastern Europe about 10, 15 years later to see how they were reintegrating into market economies, see how these institutions were reforming after being, beholden to central planning for decades and decades. So what he was doing was going through the Romanian countryside to all these different villages, seeing how their lives were changing and any problems they were encountering or good ways they figured to get back to markets. So they were in a very remote and rural part of the countryside for a long time. So they're away from any sort of cities and a lot of, any sort of infrastructure or services that you would need. And he said that basically what they did all night was drink homemade vodka. After doing that for some time, Leeson got really sick. His stomach was killing him. Got to the point where he couldn't sleep and was in constant pain. And they're nowhere near a hospital. So there was no way for him to be able to get some sort of treatment for that. But luckily, the tour guide they had said that he knew of a doctor in a very nearby village that he could take Leeson to, so he could get some sort of treatment for his stomach. So he was very excited about that until Pete got there. And he saw this guy who's living in a hut. It's full of weird potion and these odd ceremonial things. It turns out that this doctor wasn't actually a physician. This doctor was a witch doctor, like you would see in the movies. And I'm not joking, like when Leeson would talk about this in like presentations or in class, like this is a real life witch doctor that he went to. So there's things like these odd potions with like weird smells and like cooking in cauldrons and stuff, like old prayers and rituals and drinking of these potions. Obviously, Leeson like got out of there real quick and just suffered through his stomach pain for another couple weeks. But what are witch doctors? These witch doctors are healers. Then they provide treatment for different ailments that people living in like super, super rural areas have to deal with. Now, it's hard to believe that it's just BS, that they're not providing any sort of treatment or any service for people, because they persisted for thousands of years in these communities. So, as Leeson liked to say, let's put on our Romanian thinking caps, which is just chugging this homemade vodka. How might witch doctors actually function? What might they actually be providing? What is the purpose of all these rituals and these prayers that they undergo when they actually give people the treatments? Are these witch doctors and are their patients actually crazy? It turns out there's a rational reason for all this. So think how much pharmaceutical firms pay for research and development and how much effort they put into getting patents. The answer is a lot. They're going to put a lot of effort and spend a lot of money on this. And when these pharmaceutical firms in the United States, spend a lot of money on research and development, they want some sort of protection. They will for their intellectual property to make sure that they're able to recoup the money that they put into it. And witch doctors in rural Eastern Europe don't have the benefit of the United States patent system. So if they develop this new treatment, they figure out something that's actually going to help treat someone's ailment, they don't have a way to protect their proprietary formula to prevent other people from just using it. So what they do is they leverage this local belief in the supernatural in order to erect barriers to entry to protect their intellectual property. So here's how it works. These are actually real treatments that witch doctors are using. So they use things like ginger root to help stomach aches. Think if you did your grandma ever tell you to drink ginger ale when you have an upset stomach? I mean, it's a known treatment for it. Things like aspirin are naturally occurring. And these things can be easy to find. You go out in the forest and you find the ginger grower. You can grow the ginger yourself. So anyone can go in the woods and find this stuff. There's no real barriers to entry. So how do these witch doctors protect their treatments? They add a bunch of weird other stuff. They put in weird tasting or weird smelling, or even like weird colors, different ingredients in order to hide what they're actually giving people. So the stomach potion to cure your stomach ailment isn't just going to be ginger root. It's going to include other weird stuff to mask the taste of ginger. That way the people receiving the treatments can't figure out what it is. Then on top of that, they add in ritual prayers, singing special required words, maybe a close relationship with the gods, other things to prevent people from doing it on their own. So now the patients think that you need not only this weird tasting potion, but you also need to have some sort of spiritual relationship with a higher power that's helping the treatments actually work. So it prevents normal people from doing it themselves. So what we see is we have normal remedies that actually help people with these ailments, but they're disguised so the witch doctors can use them and be the only ones to use them. So it's actually a genius idea. Now, it may require a previous belief in supernatural. You may need people that are superstitious, but even if people are just a little stitious, it can still work because these treatments that they're using are actually effective. So when you see, they may see someone like praying over them or over the patients, having these very weird tasting and oddly created potions that have a very specific method of how you make them. They may think, oh, this is like kind of BS, but if it works, people will be convinced pretty easily, and they'll be willing to follow this for a while. It also provides a safe living for the witch doctor. By having these prayers and these rituals that are needed and this spiritual connection with a higher power, plus the very odd and very in-depth recipes for these potions, these are barriers to a barrier to entry. So it's basically like occupational licensing for these witch doctors. And witch doctors train their assistant who eventually becomes their replacement. And because you need to learn these treatments from the witch doctor and all these different teachings from the witch doctor, it severely limits entry into the profession. So it protects their jobs. So it turns out Pete would have been perfectly fine going to the witch doctor and would have actually had a pretty decent treatment, a natural remedy, and he'd have felt better after a day or so. So what witch doctors isn't some crazy old superstition, but it's a rational response to a lack of intellectual property protection. They use superstition to protect their recipes, and they use weird ingredients to hide what they're actually using. Now we'll move on to the next topic, gypsy law. And we hear about gypsies sometimes. Cher and Fleetwood Mac sing about it. And I can reference Fleetwood Mac now because TikTok made them cool again. Most of the characters in Peaky Blinders are gypsies. And there was that show on TLC, My Big Fat American Gypsy Wedding. So we see these things about gypsies or hear these things about gypsies. Gypsies have some very odd cultural practices and laws that go along with their way of life. What they do is they have a very intricate set of laws that are intermixed with their religious beliefs. This may seem strange to us and totally different than how laws function in the United States and how they're designed in the United States. So rather than a separation of church and state like we have, they've actually combined the church and state, and they rely on the church and these supernatural and religious beliefs to actually develop and enforce their laws. And these aren't legislated, they're very old traditions that these societies have. Now, their society is very different than ours, so they have very different problems that they have to solve. So we'd expect their laws to look different from our society. Whoops, sorry about that. Most societies rely on government to police antisocial behavior, but it doesn't work well for nomads that are dispersed. Remember, gypsies are nomadic people. They travel around in caravans. They don't set up permanent settlements. So they can't use the government or simple ostracism where you just shun someone to produce social order like other groups are able to. Typically, fringe societies and fringe groups that can't rely on government have their own laws, and they enforce their own laws. They police themselves rather than relying on outside groups. An example of this is Wild Wild Country on Netflix. If you haven't seen that documentary, I highly recommend it. It's about this hippie Indian group called the Sri Rajneesh that moved from India to Oregon and then tried to take over the government. First, like the town government and then county government, and they were trying to take over like the whole state government before everything collapsed. But basically, they operated outside of U.S. law. Not that they were doing anything illegal, but they relied on internal governance to police people's behavior. They lived on a giant ranch out in the middle of nowhere in Oregon, and they policed themselves and had their own laws that they relied upon, and which were somewhat different from the U.S. laws. Now, it was easy for them because, they all lived on the same giant ranch. Gypsies have different problems to deal with. Um, they're very spread out, and that's why they have these different beliefs. So we're going to walk through some of the problems faced by Gypsy society and see why their odd beliefs are effective ways that they're actually dealing with these problems that they face that other societies don't face. So usually when someone acts up and they harm someone, we have government deal with it. It's very simple, very effective. We use the police powers of the state to make sure this antisocial behavior doesn't persist. And if someone engages in antisocial behavior, if they cheat someone, they back out of a contract that they agreed to, if they punch someone in the face or kill someone, we have the state step in and punish them for that. For some people, this is impossible. So some societies use ostracism. They stigmatize people and they refuse to deal with them if they act antisocially. This can be very effective when people are in close contact together. They're constantly on top of each other, and there's a lot of people that can witness other people's behavior. So everyone very easily sees when someone's acting antisocially. So it's very easy to engage in this ostracism. For instance, if someone in your fraternity or sorority skips meetings and philanthropy events, it's easy for you guys to keep track of it, and you don't let them go to the party, so you punish them somehow. You ostracize them from the fun you're having. If someone on your sports team skips practice or skips weightlifting, you don't let them play. Now, these can be effective when the observation of others is easy and the government isn't able to. Going to them would be more difficult. It would be a lot more expensive and time-consuming to use the government to punish someone on your team that skipped weightlifting than it is to just handle it in-house and not decide to not play them yourselves. But for some societies, even this is impossible. Because they may be so spread out, it's difficult for a lot of people to watch what everyone else is doing, so you can catch that antisocial behavior. So these groups are forced to use other methods to ensure people don't act antisocially. So like cheating, breaking contracts, beating people up, murdering people, things like that. So that's why gypsies developed their law. And gypsy law is grounded in these unusual superstitions. Basically what they do is they see unguarded contact with the lower half of the body as ritually polluting. Everything below the waist on the human body is considered dirty. Everything above that is considered clean. And if you've become ritualistically impure, it's physically contagious to other people. And non-gypsies, because we don't follow gypsy law, are in an extreme state of such defilement. So the Romanya is the gypsy law, and it's both customary and oral, so it's handed down to generations, and it's not like official written code, it's not legislated. It's just the way they've lived and they've passed down from generation to generation. Now, marima is ritual pollution. It's something that's dirty, that's breaking gypsy law. And vujo is ritual cleanliness, or following gypsy law. So gypsy law is based on sexual purity. Because you have people that are moving across the countryside, it's very easy for them, for these nomads, to have sex and to just remove themselves from all the consequences. So it shouldn't be surprising that gypsy law is built on these sexual ideas. Basic idea is that the body is unclean, or marim, below the waist. So if there's unguarded contact with the unclean portion of the body, it's going to make that person marim. So walk through some examples, just so we could see how odd gypsy law is compared to, the Western common law that we're used to dealing with. Women's skirts are marim because they contact the lower parts of their bodies directly. Similarly, men's pants are also marim, but less so than the women's skirts. Walking in front of a seated man so that a woman's genitals passes in front of his head is enough to pollute him because, again, the genitals are marim. Even walking over a man on the floor above the room that he's present has the same effect of making the man marim. When women are preparing food, they have to wear aprons to cover up their skirts so that the marim skirts don't pollute the food that's being cooked. There's even an example that one of the gypsyologists gives of a bunch of young women picking berries, throwing them in baskets. The one woman stepped over the basket of berries, and they had to throw those out because the unguarded contact with the lower half of her body made the berries marim. And now sex is very delicate for the gypsies. So because it involves physical contact between the male and female body's lower halves. So oral and anal sex, different types of sex other than like, the plain vanilla sex, are considered marima. When men and women undress, they have to face away from each other so they don't pollute each other with the lower half of their body. Very odd to us, in-depth rules. So the hands for gypsies are very tricky because they go between the body's upper and lower halves. So you have the upper half, the clean half, the head being the cleanest part of the human body, and the lower marima half. So gypsies can't wash their hands in the same sink that they use for cleaning dishes or for eating utensils, because the hands are marima, that would make the dishes and eating utensils marima. And if they use those, then they would become marima. Gypsies can't use sponges or cloths that they use to clean their bodies to wash dishes or cutlery. So they have to have separate cleaning things for the body and for the things they use. And dishes or other utensils that a person washes in the wrong sink or with the wrong cloth instantly become marima, and they must be thrown out. They have to get rid of them. So they actually have to destroy their property if they don't follow these very specific, very thus seemingly odd rules. And there's some other stuff. Dogs and cats are considered marima, and all non-gypsies or the geisha are considered marima because we don't follow the gypsies' purity laws. So if you have a gypsy that has to eat away from home, they have to bring their own disposable cutlery. They have to bring their own prepackaged food because they can't have the vujo or the gaje, They can't have people like us cook the food for them because it's not being prepared according to gypsy customary law, to the Romagna. They also won't allow non-gypsies into their living spaces. They may allow them in like the front parlor and that's it. They'll have a special chair for them to visit and they'll clean that off afterwards. And they'll only reserve that for the geisha. They prevent or avoid any unnecessary contact with the geisha, except for some limited economic interactions. So for example, in the gypsy fortune telling business, the Afizi, gypsies cover the seats with a protective slip to prevent asgaje from polluting them and becoming marima. All right, so these are very odd rules, but why do the gypsies develop these odd rules? What problems are they trying to solve? So first is gypsies cannot rely on state institutions to enforce their contracts. A lot of their contracts are illegal. For marriages, they still use bride prices, which aren't enforced by most Western nations. A lot of their economic contracts, well, they'll create like fortune telling businesses. They'll actually just be collections of cartels from different family members, which again aren't enforceable contracts in most states. Now, ostracism is a very effective way for a large fraction of societies, or when a large fraction of society's members can monitor each member's behavior, and when they can easily communicate. So they can learn about who to punish for the people watching, everyone else. You see when the person behaves antisocially, and we need to avoid that person. And it's easy to communicate across society. So everyone knows to avoid dealing with that person. Kind of like on The Office when Dwight Schrute as a kid was shunned because he doesn't save, I think it was the juice from a can of tuna. Same basic idea is if you can see people easily and communicate to others in your community, then you can ostracize people that are engaging in antisocial behavior. Now, if only a few individuals can cheaply monitor other society members and learn about who to punish directly, communication becomes essential for whether ostracism can work or not. If society-wide communication is very cheap and easy, people, all live together or live close by, you can have a socially coordinated boycott of someone who's engaging in these bad behaviors. But gypsies, they live in traveling caravans. They're very spread out from each other. Until very recently, it was very difficult for them to communicate to one another, except for when they happen to pass each other. So this prevents direct monitoring. It makes it very difficult to monitor and observe what other people do. And gypsies' locations are constantly changing. So again, very difficult to even find that person again, or to find other people to give the information to, say, hey, this person is behaving antisocially, we need to shun them. So what do gypsies do? Gypsies use superstition to turn these antisocial practices, so getting into fights with other people, going back on contracts, cheating on people, things like that. they take these antisocial things that should be typically handled through the legal system, and they turn them into spiritual crimes. They make them spiritually forbidden. So there's basically no difference between crimes against gypsies and this unclean ritual behavior. So the gypsies don't see a difference between washing your dishes in the wrong sink where you wash your hands, that makes you marima, and getting in a fight and beating up another gypsy. Those are both considered ritualistically impure, and the person that becomes marima is physically contagious, so they can get other gypsies, make them marima just from dealing with them. So group punishment that the gypsies have, there's a problem with trying to do it in a normal way like other societies do. There's a collective action problem. And collective action means basically getting a group of people to all agree on doing something and then actually doing it. So when punishing a rule breaker is costly, let's say that this person is a friend or a family member of yours, or maybe it's very difficult to go through the history of each person and find out whether they did something bad or not that makes them marima. Participation in punishment is like a public good. So society members have incentive to free ride other people. You let other people ostracize that person, but you keep dealing with them because they're, a family member that you like, or because it's very difficult and time consuming to figure out if they actually did something bad or not. Basically, you let everyone else ostracize them, you keep talking to them. So that makes boycotts very difficult for gypsies. And it'll be very difficult for someone else to catch you for dealing with them because you're so spread out from the other gypsies and it's hard to monitor each other. So what they do is they turn these superstitions or these antisocial practices into spiritual transgressions. And they leverage this superstition to enforce desirable behavior that they want to see in their societies when there's no other way for them to do so. So like I mentioned that marima is contagious. So one gypsy that breaks the law, they deal with other gypsies, they have dinner with them, they hang out with them, they go into contracts with them. That makes the clean gypsy who dealt with them, that makes them marima. And now they're going to be shunned from society. So if you have a lot of people, basically you need pretty much everyone to believe in these religious or these superstition beliefs. If you have most of society doing that, the idea of contagiousness of this marima will make it worth it for people to seek out and understand, learn the whole history of this new person that they met, to find out if this gypsy is actually marima or if they just wanted to, travel somewhere else. So it forces each person to police themselves, to watch themselves, because even if someone else is not watching them to see if they're adhering to gypsy law, they know that no one else is going to deal with them because they're going to make them marima. Oops. There we go. So now the cost of adhering to the Romania is very high. So what this does is it screens out the weak believers. In the Bible, in the New Testament, a lot of the letters from the apostles talk about lukewarm believers and the danger it presents to communities. It's very true from this sense of communities trying to police themselves. You can't have weak believers because then the Romania will not work. You'll have a number of people who are not willing to do the sort of self-policing that's required for the Romania to work. So for example, gypsyologists talk about brawls between several men. For a woman to stop that, to stop her husband from getting beaten up, she would just run out and shake her skirt at the guys in the fight. And what they would do, they'd instantly stop and try to avoid her because the skirt is considered marima. They were more afraid of becoming marima, becoming impure and having to be forced out of the gypsy community than they were finishing the fight and beating that dude up. And these were, a woman shaking her skirt at a man was a very effective way to stop him from doing something that would harm, her family, herself, someone she cared about. So the gypsy is the first line of legal monitoring in their system. And this because the lawbreakers believe in supernatural punishment. They've combined the unbending notion of purity and impurity, which governs most of gypsies' behavior, into the sort of legal ideas of enforcing contracts, not assaulting people, things like that. So it's just as polluting, like I mentioned, to have unguarded contact with the lower half of someone's body as it is to beat someone up or to cheat on an agreement you've made with someone. And the crimes that make someone Marima are contagious, just like the ritual violations. So each gypsy has a very strong incentive to know the history of a new person that joins them. They have a new person coming to their camp. It can be very difficult to, ask around all the gypsies they know to figure out, is this person clean or are they Marima? Did they do something wrong? Typically, they would have no or very little incentive to try to learn about the person. But because the Marima is contagious, they now have to take this into account, and they have to look at the history of that person. And then the disdain for the Gaja world, for the non-gypsy world, makes the threat of punishment severe. A lot of gypsies have serious problems that are kicked out, and they struggle to live in this very different world from what they grew up in. So now there's some falsifiable beliefs we can look at to see whether gypsy law actually confirms to this theory that we have, or whether it's just kind of, I don't know, a BS thing we came up with later to describe what's going on. So the idea of Marima is only important for prime age individuals. So children before puberty are excluded, and the elderly are excluded from this. Now, 96% of crimes in the US are committed by prime age adults. So basically, people that have reached puberty up until old age, almost all of them are committed by prime age adults. And most of them are committed by males 18 to 24, 16 to 24. So we would expect, if they're just trying to prevent this antisocial behavior, if this gypsy law is designed to prevent these crimes, that they would only cover the people that are likely to commit crimes. And that's exactly what we see. So they tie the concept of spiritual purity to antisocial behavior, so physical crime or cheating gypsies. So only those that are highly likely to commit crimes are the ones that have to abide by these full spiritual purity laws. Old people cannot transmit marim or ritual impurity to other people. Likewise, children cannot do that. Children are considered innocent as well. So only the people that are likely to commit crimes have to abide by these spiritual purity rules. And as beliefs in these superstitions wane over time, the reliance on the Romagna wanes as well. So like pretty much all religions over the past 50 or so years, the belief in the Marim among gypsies has been greatly diminished. And what we see is that the Romagna taboos are falling by the wayside. So a lot of gypsy groups are no longer abiding by these strict Romagna taboos. So they don't care about, stepping over a basket of berries that they just picked, or making sure that they wash dishes in the proper sink, not the ones that they wash their hand in. And the Chris, this is like a governing council over the gypsies that they're like elders that try to arbitrate disputes. They're becoming used less and less. And all the rulings of the Chris are backed up by their purity rules. So someone that doesn't agree to use the Chris's, doesn't abide by their punishment or doesn't abide by their ruling, they become Marima. So refusal to have these civil penalties results in spiritual impurity. At this point in time, cell phones make communications between gypsies easier, and life is less nomadic for modern gypsies. They're not moving like they used to in the past. So they end up with these fixed communities. As they are able to communicate with each other cheaply and living by each other in larger and larger groups, they don't need to develop these or use these odd spiritual beliefs anymore in order to monitor each other, because they're able to physically watch each other. So they can opt for using ostracism, or they can even use state courts. Gypsies in California have been using the California state courts to enforce more and more contracts between them. Obviously not all, because some of these things like bride prices or cartels are not supported by US law. But a lot of the things that are legal under US law, under like contracts, are able to be enforced. So they no longer need the Chris for that. They no longer need the Romagna to do that. All right, now let's move on we'll end class, we have 15 minutes left, with medieval ordeals. So how do we catch criminals today? If you watch Law and Order, then you know they use DNA, fingerprints, cameras, phone records, a lot of other scientific methods in order to find suspects and convict them in court. Today, we have a lot of scientific advancements that give prosecutors and the law enforcement a lot of tools to identify and catch criminals much easier than we were able to in the past. It goes without saying, but since they're paying me, I'll say it anyway. It's important for societies to find and apprehend criminals in order to keep crime as low as possible. Gypsies developed these incredibly complex taboos and superstitions to do it. Medieval Europe, they used ordeals to try to make sure they catch the people that are committing crimes. If you're a loser like me who watches 30-year-old crime shows, you can see how since like 1990, police technology that they use to catch criminals has changed dramatically. You can see just how much easier it makes to catch criminals. But for a long time, this wasn't possible. And police, law enforcement, whoever was forced to design other methods, use other tricks to try to catch people that were guilty. Now, for 400 years, the most sophisticated people in Europe, and this was all across Europe, from Spain to Italy to England to the Scandinavian countries to Germany, France, all these different countries, even Eastern Europe, Romania and the Ukraine, they used these ordeals in order to find out if someone was guilty or innocent. What they did was had the defendant throw their arm into a cauldron of boiling water and fish out a ring. If their arm was unharmed, the accused was exonerated. If not, if their arm was covered in like scars or boils or whatever, they were considered guilty. Other people had to pick up a hot iron out of a fire and carry that around. Same thing. If they were injured, it was evidence that they were guilty. Other people were thrown into lakes to determine their guilt or innocence. Now, this sounds barbaric. This sounds very irrational. But what if this was the best way to determine guilt? Now, ordeals weren't used in every sort of court case anytime someone was accused of crime. They were only used in cases where there wasn't clear evidence on who committed the crime. A quote from the time, "Let doubtful cases be determined by the judgment of God. The judges may decide that which they clearly know, but that which they cannot know shall be reserved for divine judgment." They believed that God would step in and prevent the innocent from being hurt. Now remember, in the Middle Ages, the religious and the legal and political institutions were completely tied together. So you have religious institutions that are ones heavily involved in creating the political environment. The divine right of kings, or the monarchs at this time, were they were allowed to rule. They were granted the ability to rule by God. Now, ordeals were used from like the 9th to the 13th century, although they may have been used even before the 9th century. Now, what it relied on was a medieval superstition or medieval religious belief called Judicium Dei, or the judgment of God. So there were two types of ordeals. There were hot and cold ordeals. So for the hot ordeals that we're mostly going to talk about is plunging your arm into a pot of boiling water and you fish out a stone or a ring. Then you're bandaged up. And a week later or sometime later, the priest looks at it and sees whether you were injured or whether you had been healed by God or prevented from being injured by God. Then there were cold ordeals, where a person was bound and thrown in cold water and they either floated or sunk. If they sunk, that meant they were innocent. If they floated on top of the water, that meant that the water rejected them because they were guilty. Now, obviously, it sounds like everyone who undergoes these ordeals are going to be injured. They're going to be hurt. So it's going to find everyone guilty. But in fact, these ordeals time and time again exonerated the people that were undergoing them. So boiling water rarely boiled persons who plunged their arms into it, and they suffered no injuries. These hot irons rarely burned the persons who carried it. People that were thrown into the water were declared innocent all the time. Now, these ordeal outcomes were miraculous, but they were miracles of the design mechanism. They weren't miracles of God physically intervening. So you may think, why didn't they just use torture back then to force people into confessions? Well, torture can be effective, making people say things that you want to, but torture gives inconsistent results and that are often inaccurate. And It's Always Sunny, Danny DeVito puts it out better than I could. He says, I got Dee to admit to shit she never did when he waterboards her in a urinal for like a half hour. So you can't trust the actual results of torture. So they needed to find another way. So what ordeals were a way to separate the guilty from the innocent. It's easy to dismiss these as irrational customs of dark age ignorance, but they served a very useful purpose. So what these ordeals did, in effect, was separate the guilty from the innocent. So if a defendant confessed, or if there's a reliable witness to testify against them, the court would convince that person without using the ordeal. But if there was no clear-cut evidence that they could use to convict someone, they would turn to God to do that. So according to the medieval Christian belief, if priests performed these appropriate rituals, they, said the mass, they called out the proper prayers to God, God would reveal the individual's guilt by letting boiling water or burning iron harm them, or make the holy water reject their guilty bodies, and reveal their innocence by miraculously saving their limbs from harm, or accepting their guiltless bodies into his blessed pool, a literal phrase that they used. So what this does, if you believe in Judicium Dei, is that there's different costs imposed based on your guilt. So if you're guilty, you believe you're going to be harmed by the ordeal, that God is not going to step in and protect you. Then after you fail the ordeal, you're still going to be punished. You're still going to have to go to jail. So if you're guilty, it's less costly just to confess to the crime rather than suffer the results of the ordeal and then have to go to jail anyway and have the same exact punishment. So you can either have physical harm and, that your punishment in jail, or you can just confess and have your punishment in jail. Now, if you're innocent, you're not going to be harmed because of God's intervention. God is going to step in and protect you. So you'll be willing to undergo the ordeal. You will stand up and proudly say, yes, I will undergo the ordeal because God will protect me. And this belief was persistent in medieval Europe in this Judicium Dei. They believed that God would step in and protect the innocent, so they were more than willing to undergo the ordeals. So these ordeals incentivize the accused to reveal their criminal status to the legal system. Now, in practice, was this the hand of God? Was it Judicia Dei, or was it Judicia Cleri? So the priest knew the local community members very well. The church was the center of the community in these medieval villages. So the priest would know if someone was likely to have committed these crimes or not, what they typically did with their times, who they had problems with, if they needed to, steal something for their family or not. So when there's belief in Judicia Dei, the sworn equilibrium is that only the innocent are going to undergo the ordeals, because the innocent believe that they're not going to be harmed. The guilty believe they will be harmed and punished anyway. So they'll just confess and take the punishment without the pain. So because only innocent people are going to undertake the ordeals, the priest can fix the ordeal so that the innocent defendant is unharmed. Now there's this long quote here I'm not going to read because of the amount of time we have left. But basically, this lays out how the priest had a lot of latitude over the service when this is for a hot iron ordeal. But they had a lot of leeway to decide just how hot to make the fire, how long to last, the prayers and everything. So they could manipulate the outcome of the ordeal based on whether they thought the person was guilty or innocent. I'll note, because it's a Catholic school and I'm a Catholic myself, because of the doctrine of in persona Christi, where the priest often is a conduit for Christ's actions, having the priests, artificially weaken these to allow the innocent to go free is not inconsistent with Judicia Dei. So because God could be acting through the priest can, use their knowledge to let the innocent people off and have it not be inconsistent with the belief in God overseeing this. So to briefly summarize the latitude that priests had, and this is just for the hot iron ordeal, Only the priest and the proband, so the accused person, were allowed in the church after the priest made the ordeal fire that they were putting the iron into. And then they could not mend the fire after the communion consecration. So you had this whole ending period of Mass where the priest could pray as much as they wanted for as long as they wanted to let the fire die down so the iron would not be as hot. Now, the observers, there were witnesses for both sides, for the accused and for the either the state or the person that was harmed. Those observers had to stay along the church's walls for the length of the ordeal, so they were far away from the priest and the proband. And the ordeal instructions directed the priest to sprinkle the proband's hand with holy water immediately before he carried the iron. So it's very easy to imagine that if the priest wanted to manipulate it, they could pour water all over the hand, again, just to make it that much less likely to burn. And then it was up to the priest to determine whether the person was unharmed or not. And they were the only person that looked at it in that situation. They weren't, surrounded by witnesses peering over their shoulders. So the priest had a ton of latitude in these situations. Another way they manipulated the outcomes of the ordeals was whether they sent someone to cold or warm water ordeals. So men have lower body fat percentages than women. So men are much more likely to sink. So they would use cold water ordeals for men and exonerate the men who underwent them. And they would not send women to cold water ordeals. So they were manipulated by who was sent to the ordeals. So is there proof? If my theory is correct, and the theory of the other economists that study this, the evidence of the ordeal outcomes should point to plenty of priestly fixing. So most probands should have been declared innocent. And this is exactly what we've seen. So there's not a ton of detailed records, but for the Basilica Nag Barad in the early 1200s AD, there were 208 cases. 62% of them, they declared the proband innocent. So unless 2/3 of priests didn't know how to heat iron, this suggests that there was some sort of rigging. The plea rolls of the English royal courts, again, almost all of them that underwent ordeals were declared innocent. The English Ire rolls, one more piece of evidence, there were 84 men and 7 women. 79 men were sent to cold water ordeals. So they were all sent to what was likely to exonerate them. Women were sent to hot water ordeals, where because they would fail if they went to the cold water ordeals where they were thrown in the lake, they sent them to the hot water ordeals where they were able to be manipulated in other ways and let them off. And there were 3 cases where a man and a woman were jointly accused of a crime, the same exact crime. In all 3 cases, the men were sent to the cold water ordeals, the women were sent to the warm water ordeals. Again, because it's more likely to have them declared innocent. Okay, we've got 1 minute left of class. I really wanted to get through this today, so I guess we're going to begin the next class with this. Thank you guys for showing up to class, for coming to this. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. If not, we'll jump into this on Wednesday. Remember, no class on Friday. And then the following Monday, we'll be back in person.